so now Winston is reading to Julia. So he's going to go back and reread chapter 1. And if you remember at the beginning of chapter 9, sorry, not the beginning, kind of in the middle of chapter 9, Winston, when he first got the book, read the first section of chapter 1 of Goldstein's book, but he is now going to go back and reread that section to her because she hasn't read that. So if it sounds familiar, it's because we've already read this part. Chapter 1, Ignorance is Strength. Throughout recorded time, and probably since the end of the Neolithic Age, there have been 3 kinds of people in the world: the high, the middle, and the low. They have been subdivided in many ways. They have borne countless different names, and their relative numbers, as well as their attitude toward one another, have varied from age to age, but the essential structure of society has never altered. Even after enormous upheavals and seemingly irrevocable changes, the same pattern has always reasserted itself, just as a gyroscope will always return to equilibrium, however far it is pushed one way or the other. "Julia, are you awake?" said Winston. "Yes, my love, I'm listening. Go on, it's marvelous." He continued reading. "The aims of these 3 groups are entirely inconceivable. The aim of the high is to remain where they are. The aim of the middle is to change places with the high. The aim of the low, when they have an aim for it, is an abiding characteristic of the low that they are too much crushed by drudgery to be more than intermittently conscious of anything outside their daily lives, is to abolish all distinctions and create a society in which all men shall be equal. Thus, throughout history, a struggle, which is the same in its main outlines, recurs over and over again. For long periods, the high seem to be securely in power, but sooner or later there always come a moment when they lose either their belief in themselves or their capacity to govern efficiently, or both. They are then overthrown by the middle, who enlist the low on their side by pretending to them that they are fighting for liberty and justice. As soon as they have reached their objective, the middle thrusts the low back into their old position of servitude, and themselves become the high. Presently, a new middle group splits off from the other groups, or from both of them, and the struggle begins over again. Of the 3 groups, only the low are never even temporarily successful in achieving their aims. It would be an exaggeration to say that throughout history there have been no progress of a material kind. Even today, in a period of decline, the average human being is physically better off than he was a few centuries ago. But no advance in wealth, no softening of manners, no reform or revolution has ever brought human equality a millimeter nearer. From the point of view of the low, no historic change has ever meant much more than a change in the name of their masters. So, we read about the high, the middle, the low, and the last time. And so we're getting into a deeper description of these 3 groups of people that historically have been just kind of the staple of societies. And so Goldstein says, okay, so you always have the high, the middle, and the low. And the high always wants to be the high, the middle wants to go up to the high, and then the low just wants like equality. And when the high become inefficient at ruling or they lose their power, the middle will enlist the low, and then they will team up. They'll overthrow the high people, and the middle will move up to the high, and they'll push the low people back down the low. And then either a group of people from the high, the new high, will break off and become the new middle. A group of people from the low will break off and become the new middle, or people from both groups will. And then that's how they decide the new middle. And you just keep going over and over and over again in that same kind of area. Okay. By the late 19th century, the reoccurrence of this pattern has become obvious to many observers. There then arose schools of thinkers who interpreted history as a cyclical process and claimed to show that inequality was the unalterable law of human life. This doctrine, of course, had always been its adherents, but in the manner in which it was now put forward, there was a significant change. In the past, the need for a hierarchical form of society had been the doctrine specifically of the high. It had been preached by kings and aristocrats, and by the priests, lawyers, and the like who were parasitical upon them, and it had generally been softened by promise of compensation and an imaginary world beyond the grave. So what are they talking about? They're talking about heaven. So they're saying, well, you preach this thing, and then you say, well, you know, you're gonna get these rewards in this, what do they call it, imaginary world beyond the grave. So in this afterlife, you'll receive rewards. So it's like, oh, if you do something nice, then you get all these things when you die and blah, blah, blah. It's that's what he's saying, is like their argument. And he's also kind of making fun of it, saying it's not real, which is important. The middle, so long as it was struggling for power, had always made use of such terms as freedom, justice, and fraternity. Now, however, the concept of human brotherhood began to be assailed by people who were not yet in positions of command, but merely hoped to be so before long. In the past, the middle had made revolutions under the banner of equality, and then had established a fresh tyranny as soon as the old one was overthrown. The new middle groups, in effect, proclaimed their tyranny beforehand. Socialism, a theory which appeared in the early 19th century and was the last link in a chain of thought stretching back to the slave rebellions of antiquity, was still deeply infected by the utopianism of past ages. But in each variant of socialism that appeared from about 1900 onwards, the aim of establishing liberty and equality was more and more openly abandoned. The new movements which appeared in the middle years of the century, Ingsoc in Oceania, Neo-Bolshevism in Europe, death worship as it is commonly called in East Asia, at the conscious age of perpetuating unfreedom and inequality. These new movements, of course, grew out of the old ones and tended to keep their names and pay lip service to the ideology. But the purpose of all of them was to arrest progress and freeze history at a chosen moment. The familiar pendulum swing was to happen once more and then stop. As usual, the high were to be turned out by the middle, who would then become the high, but this time, by conscious strategy, the high would be able to maintain their position permanently. So he's saying that we have this this reoccurring cycle of middle moving to the high, and then there's a new middle, and then the low. But the aims of all these three super states was to, final revolution, final switch, with the middle going to the high, and then it would freeze. And there would be no more change. And the high would be perpetually in the high, the middle would be perpetually in the middle, and the low would be perpetually in the low. And there would be no more change in that cycle. It would never happen again. So that they're saying that that's the aim of the party. The new doctrines arose partly because of the accumulation of historical knowledge and the growth of the historical sense, which had hardly existed before the 19th century. The cyclical movement of history was now intelligible, or appeared to be so, and if it was intelligible, then it was alterable. But the principal underlying cause was that, as early as the beginning of the 20th century, human equality had become technically possible. It was still true that men were not equal in their native talents, and that functions had to be specialized in ways that favored some individuals against others, but there was no longer any real need for class distinctions or for large differences of wealth. In earlier ages, class distinctions had not been only inevitable, but desirable. Inequality was the price of civilization. With the development of machine production, however, the case was altered. Even if it was still necessary for human beings to do different kinds of work, it was no longer necessary for them to live at different social or economic levels. Therefore, from the point of view of the new groups who were on the point of seizing power, human equality was no longer an ideal to be striven at, but a danger to be averted. In more primitive ages, when a just and peaceful society was in fact not possible, it had been fairly easy to believe in it. The idea of an earthly paradise in which men should live together in a state of brotherhood without laws and without brute labor had haunted the human imagination for thousands of years. And hi, Cade. And this vision had a certain hold even on the groups who actually profited by each historic change. The heirs of the French, English, and American revolutions had partly believed in their own phrases about the rights of man, freedom of speech, equality before the law, and the like, and had even allowed their conduct to be influenced by them to some extent. But by the fourth decade of the 20th century, all the main currents of political thought were authoritarian. The earthly paradise had been discredited at exactly the moment when it became realizable. Every new political theory, by whatever name it called itself, led back to hierarchy and regimentation. And in the general hardening of outlook that set in around about 1930, practices which had long been abandoned in some cases for hundreds of years, imprisonment without trial, the use of war prisoners as slaves, public executions, torture to extract confessions, the use of hostages, and the deportation of whole populations, not only became common again, but were tolerated and even defended by people who considered themselves enlightened and progressive.